They told him to stop. "Sir, please. You don't have to do this," one of the guards said, but the general didn't answer. In full uniform, 4 stars on his shoulder, he slowly dropped to one knee and began tying the shoe of a homeless old man who hadn't spoken a full sentence in years. People stared. Phones came out. Some laughed. Until he stood up, saluted, and spoke 7 words that made an entire park go silent. "This man carried my father through hell." It was just another morning in Madison Square Park. The sun was breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. People were walking dogs, sipping coffee, jogging, scrolling on their phones. A typical Tuesday, until it wasn't. At 7:38 a.m., a jogger slowed to a stop. Eyebrows furrowed, she glanced ahead, then pulled out her phone. A few steps away, near the edge of the sidewalk where the benches lined the fountain, a man in full military uniform, medals gleaming in the morning light, slowly bent one knee and knelt on the cold pavement. He was a 4-star general. His name tag read Gen. M. Ellison. And the man standing in front of him, he was filthy, disheveled, hair long, matted, beard tangled like weeds. His pants were torn at the ankle, and one of his boots had no laces. His skin was sunburnt and stained. Most people would have walked past him without a second glance, but this general, this highly decorated officer, was kneeling before him, and he was gently, carefully, tying the old man's boot. No media, no ceremony, no press. Just 2 men, one kneeling, one standing, and a crowd that was starting to gather. Some took out their phones, others whispered, unsure of what they were seeing. Is that a real general? What's he doing? Is that homeless guy? Someone important. A child tugged at his mother's hand. "Mommy, why is the army man tying that man's shoe?" The mother didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the scene, mouth slightly open. A police officer standing nearby approached, but paused. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure of what protocol said about a 4-star general on one knee in the middle of a public park. The old man didn't say a word. He stood there, perfectly still, looking down not at the crowd, but at the man kneeling before him. His expression was blank, not surprised, not embarrassed, just lost. Like a fog was inside him, like he didn't quite understand what was happening. But around his neck, partially visible under the collar of his faded jacket, was a silver chain, a dog tag, tarnished, scratched, but unmistakable. The general finished tying the boot, tugged the knot tight, then slowly stood up. He looked at the old man's face, searched it, as if looking for a memory or a ghost. Then he placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Still, the old man said nothing. The general nodded once, firmly, with the kind of gravity that men carry only after decades of command. Then he stepped back and stood at attention, saluting. People watching began to shift. The mood changed. The laughter died down. Phones lowered. Something sacred was happening, though most didn't yet understand what. A younger soldier, maybe 19 or 20, dressed in civilian clothes but wearing a military cap, stepped forward from the side of the square. He had been standing near a hot dog cart, unnoticed. He took off his cap, slowly, and then he saluted too. Tears streamed down his cheeks. He didn't even know who the old man was. But the general did. Flashback briefly. Earlier that morning, General Marcus Ellison had received a message, not through official channels, not a briefing or a call from the Pentagon, but a simple email, sent by a young veteran working part-time with a shelter downtown. "Sir, I believe I've seen the man from your inquiry." It said, "Dog tag reads F. J. Monroe." His heart stopped. Could it be? After all these years, General Ellison had been searching for this man for over 2 decades. Not for a promotion, not for publicity, but for something far more personal, something that began in 1974 on a hill in Da Nang, Vietnam. But that story would come later. For now, in the cold light of a New York morning, the general had one mission: honor a man no one else remembered. As the crowd swelled, whispers turned to silence. Some people lowered their heads. Some removed hats. One woman placed a hand over her heart. No music, no speeches, just presence, just reverence, and a single, haunting image burned into every witness's mind: a 4-star general kneeling on one knee. To tie the shoe of a man the world had forgotten. But not him. Not today. Not ever again. His name was Franklin James Monroe. Or at least, that was the name on the dog tag. No one in the crowd knew it then. Not the joggers. Not the man filming. Not even the young soldier saluting beside the fountain. To them, he was just another old homeless man wandering New York's endless sidewalks. But decades ago, his name echoed through military channels with a quiet respect. Sergeant First Class Franklin J. Monroe, United States Marine Corps, Vietnam, 1972-1975, Special Recon, Jungle Warfare Division. He was known for 3 things: silence, precision, and courage under fire. They called him Ghost Walker in his unit, not just because of his stealth, but because he always returned, no matter how far he went behind enemy lines. And yet, after a classified operation went sideways in 1975, he never came back. Not officially. The operation was so deep it never made the papers. A 6-man recon team, sent to extract a captured intelligence officer from a remote jungle valley on the border of Laos. The kind of mission even the brass didn't talk about afterward. Monroe was the lead. They were ambushed. According to surviving records, Monroe was last seen dragging a wounded lieutenant bleeding out from the leg over a ridge under heavy fire. Then, silence. No radio contact. No satellite pickup. No recovery. Just gone. Presumed dead. But he wasn't dead. He was broken. A local farmer found him days later, barefoot, burned, mumbling to himself in a strange mix of English and Vietnamese. He didn't know his name, didn't know where he was, but the dog tag was still around his neck. They took him to a small rural hospital, treated his wounds, but he had no documents, no memory, no family contact. By the time he made it back to the U.S., months later, he was a man without a record, a ghost. One agency passed him to another: Veterans Affairs, Homeless Services, Civil Aid. He was lost in a system designed for paperwork, not people. Eventually, he stopped trying to explain who he was, and the system stopped asking. For nearly 4 decades, Franklin wandered. He had flashes of mud, of jungle, of gunshots in the dark. Sometimes he would freeze in the middle of a sidewalk, eyes wide, like he was reliving something behind his eyes. Sometimes he'd be found humming old Marine Corps marching tunes. Other times, crouched behind dumpsters at the sound of fireworks. To most, he looked mad, but to those who truly saw him, he looked wounded, not in the body, but somewhere deeper. Meanwhile, halfway across the country, another man grew up hearing his name. Marcus Ellison was only 3 years old when his father, Gerald Ellison, came home from Vietnam on crutches. For most of his childhood, Marcus had one blurry memory sitting on his father's lap as he told the story of a man with hands like iron and feet like ghosts. "He dragged me through 3 clicks of jungle, under fire the whole time," his father would say. "If he didn't tie that tourniquet with his belt, I'd be dead. And if he didn't carry me on his back, well, you wouldn't be here, son." Marcus always remembered the way his father would pause afterward, look down, then whisper. I never got to thank him. He never made it home. Years later, Marcus would join the army himself, not just out of duty, but out of gratitude. And when he rose through the ranks, earning stars of his own, that gratitude only grew. He began searching, first casually, then seriously, digging through old personnel logs, classified mission reports, looking for names. He cross-referenced every Marine in Vietnam connected to jungle recon operations. There were thousands, then hundreds, then one, F. J. Monroe, lost during Operation Glass River, 1975. Status KIA. Body not recovered, but the file had one strange note: no next of kin, tag recovered once returned to unknown medical facility, no follow-up. It was enough. General Ellison launched a quiet, personal mission. He called in favors, asked around veteran groups, sent anonymous donations to shelters, and waited. It was a rookie aid worker named Tom Alvarez, only 24, just out of the Navy, who sent the email. He worked nights at the Midtown shelter, handing out socks and soup. That morning, he saw an old man curled up outside the door, clutching his boot like it was a life vest. As he helped him up, something metallic clinked under his collar, a tag. Tom had seen plenty of dog tags in his life, but this one was different. Old, personal, etched from an era before machines polished them. He wiped it gently. Monroe, F. J. USMC, O. Pius Catholic. He remembered the name. Barely. From an old email his supervisor forwarded from some general guy looking for a ghost. He snapped a picture, and he hit send. That same evening, Marcus Ellison stepped out of the Pentagon quietly. No motorcade, no protocol. He took the next flight to New York, alone. By sunrise, he stood on the edge of Madison Square Park, staring across the pavement at a man leaning against a bench with long white hair, a ragged coat, and an old, unlaced boot, and around his neck, the tag, still there, after all these years. He didn't want to approach with cameras, or fanfare, or questions. He walked slowly, quietly, stopped in front of the man, and dropped to one knee. One simple gesture. No speeches, no medals. Just one man who owed his life to another tying his shoelace. The moment General Ellison knelt, the crowd began to shift, not because they knew the full story, not yet, but because something about the act pierced through the noise of everyday life. It cut past assumptions, past prejudice. A man in pristine uniform with medals, ribbons, polished shoes kneeling before someone who looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks. It didn't make sense, and that's what made people pause. Across the square, a cafe employee stepped out with a trash bag. He caught sight of the scene and dropped the bag without thinking. A traffic cop froze mid-ticket. A woman on a work call slowly lowered her phone. The silence spread. As if the city itself was holding its breath, General Ellison didn't speak. Not yet. He simply rose to his feet, stood tall, and looked directly into the old man's eyes. Nothing. Monroe's gaze was clouded, distant, somewhere between memory and fog. The general raised a hand, hesitated, then gently tapped 2 fingers to the dog tag resting on Monroe's chest. That small touch metal to fingertip changed something. Monroe blinked. His eyes shifted. He looked down, then slowly up. Not in alarm, but like someone remembering an old song he used to know. "Monroe," the general said, his voice low and steady. "Sergeant, 1st Recon, Da Nang, 1974. The old man didn't react at first, but then a twitch, a flicker behind the eyes. General Ellison stepped closer. "You carried my father," he said. "Lieutenant Gerald Ellison, Operation Glass River. He said you saved his life." Monroe's lips moved, barely audible. "Jungle fire. Bad hill. His voice cracked, like someone had tried to speak for years and forgotten how. "Too much blood." Monroe whispered, The general didn't break eye contact. He made it back. Because of you. He had a son. Me. And I've been looking for you ever since. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a laminated photo. A grainy, black and white shot of 6 Marines standing beside a chopper. One had his arm around a younger man, lean, sharp-eyed, serious. He handed it to Monroe. Monroe stared. Then, for the first time in decades, he exhaled. The memory hit like thunder. The gunfire, the trees, the burning, the shouting, and the boy, the officer with the leg wound, crying, bleeding, grabbing Monroe's sleeve and begging, "Please, don't leave me." And he hadn't. He never had. Monroe's knees buckled slightly. The general caught him, not like a soldier helping a comrade, but like a son catching a father. The park went completely still. From the side, Tom Alvarez, the young Navy vet who sent the tip-off email, arrived. He stopped short, recognizing the scene. There were tears on his face before he even understood why. He looked around. People were crying, some filming, some just standing in disbelief. He whispered to no one in particular. "That's him. That's Monroe." The general turned toward the crowd. "I want you to understand," he said, voice clear but gentle. "This man isn't just a veteran. He's the reason I exist." At that moment, a city sanitation worker stepped forward. She had seen Monroe around for years, shared coffee with him once, never knew his name. She removed her hat and held it over her heart. Others followed. A group of young Army recruits recognizable by their weekend civvies and high and tight haircuts walked up slowly. Uncertain at first, one of them, a black woman not older than 22, came to attention. "Permission to salute, sir," she asked, voice shaking. General Ellison nodded. She raised her hand sharply. So did the others. One by one, they formed a half-circle around Monroe, not facing him, facing outward, as if to say, "You're not forgotten. You're protected now." A young child wandered into the scene, holding her father's hand. She pointed and asked, "Is that man a king?" Her father knelt beside her and whispered, "No, baby. He's something rarer." News spread fast. The first clip hit social media 10 minutes later. It had no caption, no narration, just a shaky video of a 4-star general tying the shoe of a homeless man, then saluting him like a war hero. By noon, every major outlet had picked it up. People wanted to know, who is he? Why did the general kneel? What does it mean? And the truth came in waves. A Pentagon statement confirmed Monroe's service. A Marine Corps historian unearthed lost records, matching Monroe's name and badge number. They found mission logs, accounts of Operation Glass River. They found confirmation of Lt. Gerald Ellison's rescue, and the name of the man who saved him, Sergeant Franklin J. Monroe. They also found something else, a note written by Lt. Ellison shortly before his death in 2016. It was never published, never sent, but in it he wrote, "If I could shake the hand of the man who carried me, I would fall to my knees in gratitude, because he gave me the greatest gift a soldier can receive, a second chance to come home." His son had just done exactly that. By early afternoon, the video had gone viral, but back in Madison Square Park, none of that mattered yet. The world outside was still catching up. Here, at ground zero of an unspoken moment, a kind of sacred stillness had taken over. It wasn't just quiet, it was respectful. It was reverent. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be asked for, the kind that happens when something bigger than words enters the room. Monroe was now seated gently on a nearby bench. His boots, now laced, rested squarely on the pavement. His back was a little straighter. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly, and around him, people stood in a loose circle. No one too close. No one speaking above a whisper. General Ellison stood beside him, arms folded behind his back, not saying a word. The crowd didn't leave. In fact, it grew. More veterans arrived, some from nearby. Some had rushed from their homes or offices after seeing the first footage online. One man came still wearing his mechanic's uniform with grease on his hands. Another arrived in a wheelchair with his grandson pushing him. All of them came to see him. Not the general. Him. The man who once was Ghost Walker, now found again in the middle of a park he likely couldn't even name. A woman in a nurse's uniform stepped forward. She knelt down and held out a water bottle. Monroe stared at it. Then, carefully, he reached out, accepted it, and whispered, "Thank you." It might have been the first full sentence he'd said in hours. The nurse's eyes welled up. Then something happened that no one could have scripted. A low, steady hum of tires. From Fifth Avenue, 4 dark-colored vehicles rolled slowly toward the park entrance, 2 black SUVs and 2 older-model Army Hummers. They didn't rush. They didn't honk. They simply arrived. From the first SUV stepped a tall man in a dark suit, a briefcase in one hand, an American flag pin on his lapel. He approached the bench. General Ellison nodded at him but said nothing. The man leaned down and introduced himself, quietly. "Sir," he said to Monroe, "my name is Daniel Price. I work for the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've come to make sure you're properly cared for." Monroe blinked. "Why?" he asked softly. "Mr. Price answered without hesitation. "Because we should have done it 40 years ago." The general took a small step forward and raised his voice not loudly, but clearly, for all to hear. This man was left behind, not in war, but in peace. He paused, but not anymore, and then he did something unexpected. He turned to the crowd and said, "If you served, stand with me." And slowly, one by one, they came forward, men and women in jeans, in scrubs, in business suits, no uniforms, no ranks, just quiet pride. They stood in a semicircle behind the bench, facing outward, again, a human wall of honor, and when they stood still, something changed again. A child began humming taps, softly, barely above a breath, but the melody caught. Another child picked it up. Then a teenager with a portable speaker found the track and pressed play. The haunting, single trumpet tone filled the square. No one moved, no one filmed, not anymore. Then came the pilot. Nobody knew who he was at first, but he walked through the edge of the crowd, his captain's stripes visible on the shoulder of his uniform jacket, and approached slowly, respectfully. He said nothing. He just stopped in front of Monroe, stood at attention, and saluted. The kind of crisp, clean salute only a man trained by decades of discipline could deliver. And then he spoke, voice quiet, low, full of gravel. "Welcome home, Sergeant." Monroe looked up. Their eyes met. Something old stirred in Monroe's expression, a kind of clarity, just for a moment. And then he nodded. Somewhere in the city, church bells rang. Not for Monroe, not for the general, but it didn't matter, because in that moment, the timing felt ordained. The wind blew just enough to lift the small American flag someone had tucked into the bench's backrest. It fluttered once, twice, and then held still. The silence lingered. The kind that tells you a chapter is ending, or perhaps just beginning again. Monroe took a deep breath, then looked up at the sky. It was clear, bright, blue, as if the heavens themselves were standing at attention. The following morning, Monroe woke up in a hospital bed. Clean sheets, soft light, no sirens outside, no cold pavement underneath him. He blinked slowly, unsure if it was real. The room was quiet, except for the gentle beep of a heart monitor. At the foot of his bed, a young nurse sat on a folding chair, reading a book. When she noticed he was awake, she smiled. "Good morning, Sergeant Monroe," she said gently. "You're safe." Across the room sat General Ellison, still in uniform but missing his jacket. He looked tired, in a good way, like a man who had been holding something in for a long time, and had finally let it go. Monroe turned toward him, groggy. "You stayed," he mumbled. Ellison nodded. "Of course I did." Monroe tried to sit up. The nurse helped him. Then, for the first time in years, he reached for the dog tag around his neck, the one that had hung there through every storm, every night on the street, every forgotten birthday and Christmas. He stared at it, ran his thumb over the faded letters, and whispered, "I thought this didn't matter anymore." The general leaned forward. "It matters to me," he said. "It always did." That week, Monroe was moved to a private care facility courtesy of a full federal grant authorized within 48 hours of the park video going viral. The president himself had called General Ellison the night it aired. "You did something rare today," he said. "You reminded us." The news outlets flooded in. CNN, CBS, Fox, the New York Times, NPR, but Ellison refused interviews. So did Monroe. There was nothing to explain. The general said, "We honored a man who should have been honored long ago. That's all." But the world didn't forget. Veterans across the country began sharing stories of forgotten comrades, photos of lost dog tags, letters never delivered. A movement began online. Remember Monroe. It wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. 3 weeks later, something remarkable happened. Monroe began to speak more clearly. It was slow, halting. But the fog that had clouded his mind for years was beginning to lift, not because of medicine, but because of connection. People visited him, talked with him, sat with him. A retired Marine sniper from his old unit flew across the country just to shake his hand. "You once covered me with your body during mortar fire," he said. "I never knew if it was real. Now I do." They cried together. No cameras. Just two warriors remembering what it means to live. At the end of the month, a small ceremony was held, private, by invitation only, inside a quiet hall in Arlington, beneath a skylight that poured sunlight like grace onto the flag in the center of the room. There were no speeches, no reporters, only silence, and one announcement, by unanimous decision of the Department of Defense. Sergeant First Class Franklin J. Monroe is hereby reinstated, recognized for heroism under fire, and awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The medal was pinned to his chest by General Ellison himself. When Monroe rose to accept it, the entire room stood. Most had tears in their eyes, and for the first time in almost 50 years, he stood straight, not as a ghost, but as a man restored. Back home, something even more beautiful happened. The VA built a small cottage for Monroe on a quiet piece of land outside Albany, close enough to Ellison's home that he could visit often. The cottage was simple, just one story, a small porch, a garden planted by volunteers. Inside, above the fireplace, hung a single-framed photo, Monroe and Letty Gerald Ellison, taken days before that fateful mission in 1975. Two young men, smiling, unaware of the storm coming. Now, side by side again, not in battle, but in memory. Monroe lived there for 2 more years. Peacefully. He spent afternoons walking through the garden, feeding birds, listening to old jazz on the porch. Sometimes he'd get visitors, mostly veterans. Sometimes kids from the local high school, eager to meet the man the general knelt for. He never said much, but he always smiled. The day he passed, it was quiet. No pain, just stillness. They found him in his chair, wearing a flannel shirt and his old Marine Corps cap. The dog tag was still around his neck, resting on his chest like a medal. Next to him, a note. Simple. In his handwriting, It read, "Tell the General. I remember now, and thank you for not letting me disappear." At his funeral, they didn't bring celebrities or politicians. They brought people who had been saved not just on a battlefield, but by his story, people who had been lost and found hope again. Hundreds of them. They saluted, they cried, and as Monroe's casket was lowered into the earth, a lone bugler played taps. The notes rang out across the fields like echoes from another lifetime, and the wind lifted the flags. In the years that followed, Monroe's story became part of military training across branches not as doctrine, but as a reminder that no man should be forgotten, that some wounds are invisible, and that gratitude isn't owed by the rank above, but by the lives touched below. Back in Madison Square Park, a small bronze plaque was installed near the bench where it all began. It reads, "In honor of Sergeant Franklin J. Monroe." He walked in silence, carried others, and was finally carried home. And sometimes, just sometimes on quiet mornings, joggers pass by that bench and notice a man standing nearby, an older man in uniform, looking at the plaque, hand on his heart, and they wonder, was he the one who knelt or the one who stood? Maybe both.